At 25,000 feet above Europe, death didn't come with a warning. It came as a flicker of movement in the far distance, then a growing shape, then muzzle flashes, then the violent crack of impacts that turned aluminum into shrapnel. And for the men trapped in the tail of a B-17, it almost always came from behind. On July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Arith climbed into that rear compartment before sunrise at RAF Kimballton, watching the gray English dawn seep across the runway like smoke. The aircraft around him, big, blunt four-engine bombers, were already rumbling, their propellers biting into the air. Ground crews moved like shadows, tightening last bolts, checking lines, slapping hands on cold metal as if trying to wake the machines up. Arith was 24. He'd flown 12 combat missions. He wasn't old enough to have gray hair, but he'd seen enough to carry it in his eyes. In the bomber war of 1943, experience didn't mean comfort. It meant you'd survived long enough to count the ways people died. He crawled through the fuselage toward the tail, passing equipment racks and oxygen bottles, squeezing into tighter and tighter spaces until he reached his station, the smallest, most isolated fighting position on the aircraft. The tail gunner's compartment was barely 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. No room to stand, no room to stretch. A cramped bubble of plexiglass and metal with two 50 caliber machine guns pointing backward through a curved window. At altitude, the outside temperature could reach minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so thin it couldn't keep you alive. Without oxygen, you'd pass out in minutes. Without heat, you'd freeze. The electrically heated suit he wore wasn't comfort. It was the boundary between function and death.
The 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war for a reason. Everyone else in the B-17 could at least hear voices nearby. Arith had 40 feet of fuselage between him and the crew. If the intercom failed, he was alone, with nothing but the engine's distant vibration and the sound of his own breathing. If he was wounded, no one could crawl back fast. If the tail was hit and the compartment twisted, he could be trapped like a man sealed inside a jar. And German fighter pilots knew exactly where he sat. In the summer of 1943, the math of survival was brutal. Bomber crews were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Statistically, a B-17 crew might survive around 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners, along with ball turret gunners, were often the first to die. German pilots liked the rear approach because it was geometry turned into a weapon. Coming in from 6 o'clock gave them the longest firing window and the clearest line of attack. 10 seconds, sometimes more, of nearly straight-in shooting. 10 seconds doesn't sound like much until you imagine what a fighter's cannons could do in 10 seconds. Arith checked his ammunition belts. 400 rounds per gun, 800 total. The manual said it was enough. The manual said a gunner should hold fire until the enemy closed within 300 yards. The manual said short bursts, discipline, conservation. The manual was written like the enemy would be polite.
But the Luftwaffe wasn't polite. It was methodical. German pilots had learned American habits. They knew gunners were trained to wait. So they fired from farther out, 600 yards, launching cannon shells and heavy machine gun fire into formations before American gunners officially opened up. By the time a tail gunner decided he was allowed to shoot, plexiglass might already be exploding inward. Arith had watched that exact thing happen. On an earlier mission, a bomber off his wing took a direct hit in the tail. The German fighter came in fast and hard. The first rounds punched through the bubble. The tail gunner never fired. The bomber dropped out of formation trailing smoke. Parachutes appeared, 8 of them, but the tail gunners didn't. There were no heroics in that moment, no second chances, just a seat that went empty. That wasn't training, that was execution. So Arith began to question everything. If the enemy knew you would wait, then waiting was not discipline, it was surrender. If the enemy could fire at 600 yards while you promised not to fire until 300, then doctrine wasn't safety. Doctrine was a trap. Arith decided to do something most militaries quietly hate. He decided to innovate. His idea was not complicated, but it was heresy. Fire early. Not at 300 yards, not even at 500. Fire at 700, sometimes 800, sometimes more if the angle was clean. He had a reason. A fighter approaching from behind wasn't weaving. It was closing in a straight line, nose pointed directly at him. That meant the pilot was trying to build a stable firing solution to pour rounds into a bomber that couldn't maneuver much. From Arith's perspective, the fighter was growing larger every second, becoming an easier and easier target. If he fired early, he could walk the tracers in, starting low, correcting upward, forcing the enemy to break off before reaching effective range.
But the trade-off was ammunition. 800 rounds sounds like a mountain until you divide it by the number of attacks. A mission might see 15, 20, even 30 separate fighter passes. 50 rounds per engagement? The math turned savage quickly. Fire too much, too early, and you could end up with empty guns while still deep over enemy territory. Aruth accepted the risk anyway. A man who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had not made a smart bargain. Dead men didn't return home with spare bullets. That morning, on July 30th, the bomber stream formed up and began its long flight east. They crossed the English Channel, climbing towards their cruising altitude. Aruth watched the white cliffs of Dover shrink into the distance until England became a pale smear on the horizon. Ahead was occupied France, then Belgium, then the heart of Nazi Germany. At first, they had escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts holding position around the formation like guard dogs. Their presence meant safety, but only temporarily. The Thunderbolts couldn't stay. Fuel limitations meant they would turn back long before the bombers reached the target. Aruth watched the escorts with a kind of grim certainty. He knew the arithmetic. The mission would take hours. The P-47s had about 90 minutes of combat flying in them. At some point, the escorts would waggle their wings, peel off, and disappear. And then it would begin. It always began. When the Thunderbolts finally turned back over Belgium, Aruth felt the shift in the air, not physically, but emotionally. A formation without escorts felt like a herd without wolves. The bombers pressed on alone into the part of the sky that belonged entirely to the enemy. And then, at last, the fighters came.
At first, they were specks. Then they were silhouettes. Then they were unmistakable. Dark crosses, angular wings, sunlight flashing off canopies as they descended into position. They arrived in groups, 4 at a time, then 8, then 12, until counting no longer mattered. The sky behind Aruth filled with them. The first attacker came from high 6 o'clock, diving toward the formation at immense speed. Aruth tracked it through his sight, watching the wingspan grow, the nose steady, the pilot locked in on his approach. At 800 yards, Aruth fired. Twin Brownings roared, the recoil vibrating through his arms and chest. Tracers stitched through the air. The first rounds fell short. He adjusted, tiny shifts, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, the tracers began to connect. Sparks flashed along the fighter's engine cowling. The German pilot broke off hard, smoke trailing, the attack ruined before it could become lethal. Aruth didn't watch it fall. He couldn't. Another fighter was already closing. For the next 40-plus minutes, the tail of that bomber became a furnace of noise and violence. Fighters slashed in and out of range. Some tried to dive under his field of fire. Others came in from slightly offset angles, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock, searching for a blind spot. Aruth fired anyway, cutting long bursts when the situation demanded it, short bursts when it didn't, and sometimes firing purely to force a pilot to flinch. Because even when tracers missed, they carried a message. You're not safe here anymore.
His ammunition dropped fast. His barrels heated until they glowed. The air in his compartment stank of burned powder and hydraulic fluid. Impacts shuddered through the fuselage. Somewhere forward, men shouted on the intercom about flak and damage. Aruth focused on the one horizon that mattered, the empty space behind them, where death always appeared. Then, during the bombing run, when the bombers flew straight and level, unable to maneuver, an enemy fighter finally got through. A Focke-Wulf dove in from the rear quarter. Aruth swung his guns and fired, but the fighter kept coming. Cannon shells tore through the tail. The first thing Aruth felt was not pain, it was impact, a hammer blow through his arm, a shattering sound as plexiglass disintegrated. His heated suit ripped. Shrapnel buried itself into his shoulder and left arm. His left gun jammed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment like dark rain. He kept firing with the right gun, one-handed, bleeding, fighting the recoil, fighting the cold that instantly began to steal feeling from his wounded limb. He tracked the fighter as it pulled away and caught it with a final burst. The aircraft snapped into a roll and dove, damaged, falling out of the fight. 3 kills, wounded, almost out of ammunition. And the mission wasn't over. They still had to fly home. On the return leg, Aruth's situation changed completely. The luxury of aggressive suppression was gone.
With only dozens of rounds left and one functioning gun, every shot had to matter. He waited longer now, letting fighters come closer, 500 yards, then firing precise bursts into engine cowls and wings, aiming not just to destroy, but to force breakoffs.